much. So I know some of you I actually saw yesterday, so you already have a little bit of an idea of who I am. And then there's also some of you that have no idea who this lady is up in front of you right now, right? Except that she's from WSU. So that's one, hopefully one good strike for her, right? Now, today our topic is cold stress and calves. Okay, that's the main topic. But I actually want to give a little background information, because if this is your first introduction to me, I want you to know, well, what kind of person are you dealing with, right? What's my background? Let's start with where I came from. It all started in Wisconsin. Started in a really small little town, central Wisconsin, by like Stevens Point. It's Bancroft, that's the name of the town. I don't expect anyone to know where that is, right? Except for the fact that it's right around here, okay? Now, grew up on a small dairy farm, Grandma and Grandpa's farm. Beautiful lilacs, as you can see there, right? Typical red barn. I, as a young kid, became extremely interested in animals from the get-go. But by the time I was probably about 9 or so, Grandma and Grandpa decided they couldn't do the dairying business anymore, so they sold the animals, right? Pretty heartbreaking for me, because what was happening with me? I was just starting to get to that age where I could move up from just doing chores around the farm to maybe now I can take on some more responsibility, right? So I ended up getting involved in other species at first. It all started when I was in 2nd grade, and I told my mom I want to do 4-H. That's where I started, right? And I said I want to do dairy cattle, and she said, no, let's start smaller and work our way up. So she got me started on rabbits, and she regrets it to this day, because she's let me start with 2 rabbits. So I got 2 rabbits, and then everything was going well. Yes, that's me, showing a rabbit, right? And I did, took them to nursing homes, and but by the time I was a senior in high school, and I was getting ready to graduate and go off to college, do you think we still had 2 rabbits? No, it was more like over 100, right? And so my mom said, now what are you going to do with all these rabbits, right? Now, I also became a judge, county fair judge, working at shows, going to county fairs, helping out. And also was involved with FFA too. When I grew up in my small town, and I was a real animal person, they said you should become a veterinarian, right? So I went to University of Wisconsin River Falls and was on the pre-vet track. Like I wanted to be a veterinarian. And then, I got involved in different things, women in agriculture, and working at extension office, doing some bacterial research and dog kennels, things like that. But it took me a little while to figure out I wanted to go on to graduate school instead. And I was really interested in animal behavior. Okay, I thought it was really fascinating, I thought it was interesting. But at that point, there weren't very many people that were doing animal behavior in livestock. So I went for second best, lizards. Okay? So I ended up at Oklahoma State University working on social stress in lizards. Now you might say, what kind of social stress do you see in lizards, right? Well, quick overview, we had out in nature, males of these lizards, okay, the species, they have territories, and they can have anywhere from 1 to 8 females in a territory, okay? And our thought was, those territories that have more females in them, is that more stressful to the male, the female, or both? Okay? And on top of that, does the female take what's going on in her environment, and does she have more stress, more cortisol in her blood? Does that translate into what she puts into her egg? Okay? That's what we're looking at. So, we set up some cages. And we had, this is example, there's 1 male, 1 female in that cage. Other cages had 4 females and 1 male. And then we also went out into Shreveport, Louisiana, and actually collected from a park some of these lizards to look at samples. Which, this is interesting. Yes, that's like a fishing pole right there. So you have a fishing pole, and then you have, you know, some fishing line on the end, and you literally try to, you know, take this little, make this, you know, little circle on the end, try to wrap around their body and pull, and then whip them up, right? Try to grab them. It's like you're fishing for lizards, okay? I wasn't very good at it. What did we learn from this study? I want to throw this out there because I think a lot of you get a kick out of this. Turns out, in those cages that had more females in them, the females, they were all right with that. They weren't too stressed. You know who was really stressed, though? I see some smiles. The males that had more females in the cage, they were stressed. You know, so usually they're just beautiful, right? Pretty green color. When they're stressed, they turn brown. They're just brown, right? And their body condition goes down. That's what we were seeing in the males that had more females in their territory. Now, I finished up at lizards, decided that's not my cup of tea. I don't want to do lizards. I'd rather do livestock. So I ended up going back to dairy cattle at Texas A&M University for my PhD. Did a couple different types of studies. One of them was looking at perceptions, right? So we talk about public perception of agriculture. This was looking at student perceptions. So we have a lot of students coming into our introductory animal science class, and they don't have any animal science experience, right? And so then instructors are faced with how do you teach this? What are these perceptions they're starting with? In case you're curious, this is actually a pig using a joystick. This was a study that was pretty interesting. You know, some people think that pigs are pretty dumb, but they can be pretty smart. They were actually taught how to use a joystick to maneuver a game that was on a screen. So it was kind of interesting. Did some studies on heat stress. Now, if you're in a Texas, you know, going to the Texas Panhandle, and heat stress is probably a pretty reasonable place, Texas is a reasonable place to look at heat stress, right? It's pretty hot. And obviously you see a lot of the open lot types there. We were looking at what's going on, you know, as far as the ambient temperature heats up. Where do you see the animals moving to? Where are these cows going in their pens? And then on top of that, which obviously in this picture, it's heating up. Where are they? They're all under that shade structure, right? But then on top of that, we're looking at soil temperatures. So what's the soil temperature out here compared to out here? This cow is laying out here in the open, on, you know, out in the sun. What kind of temperatures are we looking at comparatively, right? And then we also looked at relative humidity and ambient temperature and measuring just what those cows are doing. Another study we looked at was heat stress in calves. So in this concept, we're looking at, you know, we had 57 bull calves that were 1 to 3 days of age. That's when they started on the study, okay? And we're looking at two different housing situations. So if you keep calves indoors in air conditioning during the summer, okay, versus outdoors where all they have is a roof over their head, right? What are some of those differences that you see as far as how they handle? So these animals, if they're kept in an air-conditioned, you know, climate-controlled environment, and then exposed to the outdoors, right? If, let's say, you move them into a group after weaning to and they're kept outdoors, how do they handle that? And one way that we looked at differences in behavior. So this is an example. When we look at behavior in animals, we can use like an open field test pen, which this is an example, in which we turn these calves loose, you attach pedometers to their legs, and you look at how many steps they're taking, right? And so you turn them loose. We saw some behaviors. This one, you can kind of see, you know, kind of kicking up their heels. We had some running behavior, some play behavior. Quite interesting to watch. But one of the things we took away from that, we looked at shade use, and then we also looked at these number of steps they took, right? So once that 1 hour was over in that open pen, we took their pedometers off and read, how many steps did they take during that 1 hour. And the interesting thing, so on this axis here, you're looking at the number of steps they took, okay? Look at that. In 1 hour, you're looking at, 700, a little over 700 during week 7 of steps. 700 steps. That's one calf took over 700 steps during an hour. And the THI along this axis here, so the THI, that temperature humidity index, we're looking at the equations where we throw in relative humidity and ambient temperature and come up with this index. So that's what this shows you here, is how that THI dwindled off towards the end there. And then also the weeks, so week 1 through week 7. And what we saw was that there was a difference in housing. So those calves that were housed outdoors and put into that open pen took more steps, okay? The calves that were housed indoors in that climate-controlled air conditioning environment, when they were exposed to that outdoor environment and had the opportunity to run and play or show that social, play behavior, they didn't do it as much as the ones that were housed outdoors. Where do you think we found the indoor calves the most? Hanging out under the shade, right? There's a little shade structure, and it was hard for them to, adapt, right? So they're used to that controlled climate air conditioning. Another study we looked at was transport stress in calves. Okay, so this one, we're trying to look at how much stress does transportation cause, right? How does that affect the calves? And ultimately, the key thing here is trying to figure out how do we look at stress and how do we, measure what is causing the most stress, what's the best way to transport animals, right? And we had 36 Holstein steer calves that were transported every 7 days. So this was a repeated transport, right? Do they acclimate to transportation? That's a good question. But we did this over 5 weeks, 5 consecutive weeks. So each calf went on 5 trips.
How long were the trips?
6 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you're not talking about transportation within the farm here then?
No, we're talking about longer hauls, right? So looking at that acclimation again, right? Of do you acclimate if you have repeated exposure, or do you acclimate if the travel is long, right? So if you go for a 1 hour transport, can you acclimate to that? Or if you go for an 8 hour transport, can you acclimate to that, right? So how the duration of the journey affects it, and then also if repeated transportation affects it. So in this case, we did draw some blood samples. We tried to decrease the stress associated with that, because keep in mind, these were raised since a couple days old, right? So they're familiar with us walking into the pen and collecting a blood sample and causing less stress on them. So if we take blood samples before they got in the trailer, so then the trailer takes off, right? And it drives around for 2 hours. We had a really dedicated driver, right? He drives for 2 hours, he comes back. We got onto the trailer and took blood samples. We didn't unload them, because that causes extra stress, right? So we go on the trailer and take blood samples, get off the trailer, driver takes off for another 2 hours, right? And he comes back, and we do the same thing. And then that 6 hour mark, we collect those samples again, and then we unload the animals. One thing that we looked at was the feeding behavior. So each calf also had, are you familiar with the Kalin Gates system at all? Where you can designate, each calf can have a key around its neck. And it's a gate system. So each calf or each animal is designated a certain stall to eat, right? This is your personal feed bunk. When that animal leans in to eat, it recognizes it, reads that collar, and it allows that animal to eat out of that bunk. So we collected that information.
Well, they weren't fed on the trailer at all.
They were not fed on the trailer at all, no. And so the control animals, okay, so we did have a control set that did not get transported. And they did not have access to feed while the other ones were being transported, right? So one of the interesting things, once again, we'll point out some THI numbers, and that's along this axis here. And then as far as their average feed intake is along here, and these are the days. These arrows indicate days of transport, right? So like I said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different transports, okay? Now you're looking at the solid black line. This is your control group that did not get transported. Your dashed line, this is the transported group. Those are the ones that went on those 6-hour drives, right? For feed, one of the interesting things, if you look at that transported group, the first couple of transports, you don't see much difference between that control and transported group. But then happens here, so that's after the second. Now look at this, the third trip, they come back, look at that range of difference in feed intake, right? And we also saw residual the day after, and there's another range. Now look at that last trip. That's a decent difference in how much feed they're taking in, right? One thing I want to point on this too, we did look at their behavior once they got off the trailer, right? And it was interesting, because if you were going to guess, all right, the first time they go on their first trip, they come back to their home pen, what's the first thing they would do? What do you think?
Get a drink.
Get a drink. You're exactly right. 100% went right for the water, okay? And then what do? They went and got a bite to eat. So they go take in some food, and then they go lie down, okay? Now, as we get through to that fifth trip, you see this switch over, where fewer of them are going to get a drink, and more of them are going to eat first. They want to go get something to eat. And then maybe they'll get a drink later, and then they'll lie down. So, just some interesting information.
Are the calves allowed to lay down on the trip?
On the trip, they have enough space, yes. And I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing we saw with each, so when we would stop at those 2-hour marks, right? So, after 2 hours of transport, we get on the trailer. Most calves are standing still, okay? We don't see a lot of them lying down. At the 4-hour mark, we see more calves lying down on the trailer. Like, we go in to take a blood sample, and they just lie there. 6-hour mark, almost all of them are lying on the trailer. It was interesting, right? Like, could there be some sort of, and when I didn't show because we have limited time, but the results for cortisol, right? So we can measure cortisol to look at stress in animals, right? And humans too. The cortisol, you see this decrease in cortisol as time progresses during that trip. So it peaks, at the 2-hour mark, but then it kind of starts to drop at 4 hours and then 6 hours. So, what's going on there? Is there acclimation occurring? So then I end up at Minnesota. I headed back north, right? And did a postdoc looking at automated calf feeders. And I won't touch too much on this, but you were looking at both management practices, how are people managing feeders, right? And then looking at calf behavior, how much are they drinking, are they exhibiting play behavior in this kind of group setting, and their health, so looking at serum protein and doing a health scoring system, and then the environment. Now, I want to take a quick moment because, as long as I have your attention and in case you're curious, this is just take 2 slides of a couple updates that are happening at who's been out to the Knott Dairy Center recently? Anyone? No? Okay, real quickly, it's an exciting time out at the Dairy Center. We have some changes that are being considered, things that are going on. One thing, we're working on our lagoon system. If you're familiar with what we have currently, we're getting updates on it. That's good. Our milking parlor, actually, as we speak, I believe, is being remodeled Not much right now, but enough to make a couple changes. So instead of 5 on each side, we're doing 6 on each side. Couple changes in the milking parlor. We've got a new feed truck, which is kind of exciting. And this is what our calf facility looked like, right? So it's about, I believe I hear you're 50 plus years old, okay, with no changes done in the meantime. And one thing they're doing, so this is the setup we had. It's hard to see, but back here we have these individual calf tell pens that we're switching to on at least one side. So this building, we have a capacity for 32 calves individually housed, 16 on each side, okay? So on one side, we're putting these calf tell pens in. And then I came along and said, well, if we're going to make changes to this facility, why don't we try to put in an automated calf feeder? Good question, right? I think there's some people we've seen yesterday at the calf housing symposium. Some people are interested in putting in feeders. Some people have these automated feeders and want more information. How do you make them work better? Well, you know what? Let us figure it out, right? Let's get one at the university. Let's do some research on it, and let's figure out where the issues are and provide some information. But that's not why you're here today, right? Maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not. You're actually here to talk about cold stress and calves, right? And the purpose of today is to focus on what are some of, you hear things over and over, things that you've been taught since you were little, right? But now, let's look at some of this new stuff that's coming out and see if you can apply any of it on your farm. Before we can get started, this has been mentioned, over the last day or so about, what is that zone, that thermoneutral zone for calves, right? And so, if you're less than a month old, you're looking at that 50 to 78 degree range, okay? That's where they feel comfortable. What do we mean comfortable? Well, that's where they don't require any additional energy to maintain their body temp, okay? Which is important, right? Because if they have to increase how much energy they need to use to regulate their body temperature, what does that mean? They're decreasing how much energy is available for growth. Obviously, that's bad. We don't want that. Now, if they're over a month old, then it changes a little bit, their range that they can handle, especially on that low range. But under a month, it's a little bit of a tighter range. And this gives you an idea. So on the other side of that, that's where you can run into heat stress issues too, if you get on the other end of the spectrum, right? So here here's your range for that thermoneutral zone. And here you're looking at your cold stress. So along here you're looking at temperatures, right? If you get on this side, obviously you're looking at your heat stress. It's getting too warm. Now they have to kind of regulate body heat the other way. And here is their requirements that they need, the percent of their requirements. So in the thermoneutral zone, think of this as 100%, it's level, right? And then obviously their requirements that they have go up on both sides. So does that make sense? So you obviously, once you get colder, you get hotter outside of that zone. Now, nutritionally wise, you need more. Well, now that we're looking at temperature and how that can impact, calves, what about that first lactation? I mean, that's what you're really worried about, right? How much milk can that calf get me that first lactation? Well, this is an interesting study in 2012. So like I said, we're trying to bring some of the newer stuff that's come out lately. They're actually looking at the temperature. So on this axis, we're looking at temperature. Think of this as 32.4 degrees Fahrenheit. This is 51.6. This is 61.3 and 66.6. Calves that were born, that were calved out during these different temperatures, this shows you the difference in that milk you get out of them in that first lactation. Okay? So think about this. You have a calf that's born into 32.4 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. you get almost 300 kilograms, and I should have converted it to pounds for you, but 300 kilograms less of milk during that first lactation from that calf. So even if they're born into cold temperatures, they already have a strike against them, right? In comparison, if you have a calf that's born in 61.3 degrees Fahrenheit, you can get relatively about a little over 200 kilograms more milk out of them. How does their environment, so if they have a cold environment versus a warm environment, how does that influence how much starter they take in? Okay? Because that's a concern too. You want your calves eating starter, you want them, getting onto that, eating while growing. Now, the black bars, we're looking at a warmer environment. Okay, so these calves are kept indoors in a warmer environment, and they're kept at about 59.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? The white bars, you're looking at a colder environment. They're maintained at about 40.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? What do you see here? Now this is a little counterintuitive maybe, but the calves, especially when you get into, so you're looking at weeks here, look at that, week 5, 6, week 7, those calves in those colder conditions, that 40.5 degrees, are taking in more starter than the ones that are kept at 59.9. That's kind of interesting, right? What happens if you try to increase your milk replacer rates? How does that affect things? How does that help you manage cold stress? Does it help at all? Well, let's focus in. You have 3 different rates that they fed at, okay? Now, keep in mind, this information, so that the calves are fed at these rates and then weaned, and then this information presented reflects those 28 days post-weaning. Okay, so what kind of growth are you seeing from calves that were kept on these different milking rates, or replacer rates? Those rates, okay, come down here, we're looking at actually, let's look at it in pounds, right? So you're looking at a pound of milk replacer powder, 1.25 pounds, and 1.5 pounds, okay?
Now, do you have any paperwork that has all these graphs and so forth?
I can get you. So if anyone's interested in, copy the slides, like with this information or something.
Slides,
yeah, I can get that. What I can do,
you can give us that. We can turn it into a PDF document and put it on our website. And then
we have
can send
access
that to you.
that?
So it would just be something you could pull up and see.
Okay.
And also these are videotaped, so you can go back
Refer
and see
back
this.
to them. So here we're looking, you have your different, remember 1 pound, 1.25, 1.5. You look at body weight gain, what do you see? So your gain, and once again I apologize, kilograms per day, but the main thing is what are the numbers, right? So those that were fed at a 1 pound rate had a little bit of better gain than these other two, but there's not too much of a difference. Feed intake, kilograms per day. So this is as fed, okay. Once again, you're looking at that pound rate, a little bit better, and then that gain to feed, gain to feed ratio, no significant difference. So you're seeing some different, and I thought this was interesting. These calves were kept at 9 degrees Celsius, but being fed a little bit less, this is counterintuitive, I think, to what we think. But it's something to take into consideration. What happens if you try to add, so this is a brand new study, 2014, out of Minnesota. Okay, what happens if you try to supplement with some sort of fat supplementation, right, in the diet? How does that help? Well, let's give it a look. If you have, and I added these colors in here because otherwise it was pretty hard to read, so hopefully this helps a little bit. But when you're looking at low fat, calves that had this low fat diet on this study, they had 28% crude protein, 15% fat. Okay, that's what they were being fed. Now, for a medium fat diet, they had this plus 113 grams a day of a fat supplementation. Okay? And I'll be honest, the study, they don't specify, they just say it's a commercial fat supplement. So as far as figuring out, we'd have to contact the author and say, what exactly did you use? But as far as the high fat, they bumped that fat supplementation up to 227 grams. You know what they saw? No difference, really. You know, we're looking at starter intake per day, and then as the weeks progress, there was no significant difference if they added this fat supplementation as to how much starter those calves took in.
And this is only on starter and not on milk.
Right, right.
Okay.
But what happens, or no, so let me clarify. So this graph, this is only showing how much starter they're taking in. They are still on milk.
Okay.
Does that?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, if they were newborns to, they're from 1 to 8 weeks old.
Right, so they are still,
Okay.
they are taking it, this supplementation, right, is being added to their diet, but this is measuring just the starter intake,
Okay.
but they're still on milk.
The supplementation is in the milk, or is it in the grain?
It's in the milk,
It's in the grain.
in the
not
milk, in the milk. So you're looking at fat supplementation in the milk.
Oh, so they're adding that to the milk.
They're adding this fat supplementation
Okay,
to the milk.
okay, that makes
Yep.
sense, because we were
Yep.
thinking about wondering if we should add a little bit of powder, give them a little more powder with their water
Okay,
in the cold,
right,
in the cold weather.
right. No, that makes sense. So we don't see differences when you supplement their milk with fat supplementation. Don't see differences in the starter intake of the different diets, right? What about the average daily gain? Do you see any differences there? This is the same diets, right? Look at this. I think this is interesting. If you're fed, if the calf's fed in that low-fat diet, look at that start they're getting, right? That's pretty interesting because they're not getting a very good start, right? If you compare this to the calves that are on even that medium diet, that black line, or the red, high-fat diet, they're getting a better start than those babies that are on that low-fat diet, right? So there's a little interesting thing. This we're going to touch on real quickly, and especially you've seen probably a lot of this. So now we'll turn it into a quiz, especially if you were there yesterday. What nesting score would this calf have? So let's get a refresher. Score 1, you've got a calf that the legs are fully exposed and it's kind of like it's just lying on top. It doesn't have much to nestle into, right? Score 2, legs are partially exposed, but they can slightly kind of nestle in. And then 3, no legs exposed, and they're pretty bedded in there. They can pretty snuggle in pretty deep. What is this one? Anyone? Do you know?
I think it's number 3.
You're right.
Nice.
Good job.
I taught him everything he knows.
I'm glad
I gotta work with her.
Yeah. Well, there we've got, man, you're on top of things here. That's pretty impressive. That is a score 3. Why do we care about the bedding, right? Why does that make a difference at all? It does make a difference. Here's an example. This is a 2007 study, okay? And they're looking at, the average temperature for these calves in this study was 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit, to give you some sort of, give you an idea of what temperatures we're talking about. And you have calves that are housed with straw, and calves that are housed with shavings, okay? One thing to key in, and you can look through all of these different things, but the key thing here is they're looking at body weight gain per day, and they're looking at these different time periods, okay? What are you noticing? You're noticing that straw, what happens those first 21 days? They have a little bit of a better gain. What about 0 to 42 days? A little bit better gain. It gets a little bit tighter between the two groups in that 42 to 56 days. And then overall, so that 0 to 56 days throughout the whole study, you've got a little bit of a better gain in that straw than you do in that shavings, right? Something to consider, right, when you're thinking about bedding options. Now here, this is kind of exciting, okay? This is brand new, cutting edge, out of Texas A&M University from my former advisor. So I'm pretty excited, right? They, you know, who here thinks that cold stress is an issue in Texas? Anyone?
I would think so, because it's so warm and then all of a sudden just plummets sometimes. And
Exactly.
they get so used to the warm that then they get this nasty cold.
Yeah.
I think it's
And
huge.
then, who here has ever been to the Texas Panhandle? Were you there during winter?
No, in the summer. It's miserable.
So it's miserable in the summer and it's miserable in the winter too, actually, because they've got wind blowing through there, which you guys, you understand wind, right? But they get snow and they get ice and then winter, yes, cold stress can be an issue. So what they're looking at is, and the Hutches, are commonly used, right? What can we do to these Hutches to keep them cooler inside during the summer, right? How do we cool them down? Oh, you have an idea?
Yeah, maybe they should put like blankets on the thing instead of like straw or shavings.
Straw or shavings? Should we put blankets on the calves? Would that help?
You could also do that, but I'd say like put it on the floor so it'll be laying on something soft.
So what if we put a cover on the hutch, okay? So the concept here, can you keep heat in during winter, and can you help cool it, right? So if you use reflective surfaces or non-reflective, and how can you keep the sun out of there, right? So this is an example of what they tried for summer, right? So with the white surface, and then they tried black too during the cold, right? During winter, and this was just presented at the ADSA meeting this summer. What did they see? Slightly, so they had hutches that had no cover, okay? They had hutches that had reflective covers, and they had hutches that had non-reflective covers. And what's the difference? You know what they saw them? Whether or not it was reflective or non-reflective, that didn't make much of a difference. But what did make a difference is that the hutch had a cover, because it stayed about 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer in that hutch than it did with a hutch that didn't have. Now, that's not much of a difference, right? So once again, how do we make this affordable? Can we improve this? But this is the first idea that they're playing with of what do we apply? We talk about what we can do for the calf themselves. What can we do to their environment to improve the conditions? So think about that. I want you to think about that. If that's something that, if it was affordable and you think you could, cost effective and you could use it, would you use it, and would it make a difference? Jackets for calves. He brought up jackets. I think blankets. I think that's a good idea. How many of you use jackets or blankets on your calves? A good number. Okay. Why?
For weight gain, it helps to retain body heat and get better weight gain.
There's a lot of people that have really good experiences with calf jackets and blankets, right? I mean, that you talk to somebody and they say, I can't. Someone I talked to recently just switched maybe in the last couple of years to using calf jackets, and they said, I don't know why I didn't start earlier. Okay? Interesting. How long do you keep those jackets on? That varies. I don't expect an answer right now. That's a question, right? Rhetorical question, perhaps. How long do you keep them on? First couple weeks, couple days, couple months? That varies. And there's different types, right? You have like the little pullovers, and you have other jackets that have those shells, right? Kind of quilted inside. What kind of research do we have to back up the effectiveness of those jackets? I gotta be honest with you, there isn't much. There's not much out there. We know, right? People have good experiences with them. You see the differences on your farm. But what kind of numbers do we have to back that up right now? There's not much to go off of. We have a 2004 study. These calves, they were on the trial from the day when they're 19 days old to when they're 82 days old. Jackets were taken off on day 42. Okay? Now, what they did, you have 3 different groups. Calves that were kept indoors. Okay? And then you've got calves that were kept outdoors with jackets or without jackets. Okay?
Now, the indoor one, did you do one with and without jackets?
Just without.
Okay.
So here, let's look at respiratory disease. These are the number of instances, number of treatments given, okay? So we see some differences, but nothing significant for respiratory disease if you have 0 or 1 treatment per calf, okay? Now look at this. This is where it starts to get really costly too, right? When you have to start treating a calf 2+ times, right? That's when it becomes pretty costly. That's where we start to see a difference. And the indoor calves, we actually see more instances. In this study, these calves actually had more instances of repeated treatment for respiratory disease. Which maybe that makes sense because if you're indoors, some people have ventilation issues, right? So you're getting more ammonia in there, causing maybe pneumonia, right? Now, what about if you're looking at, scouring and things like that, repeated, once again, those repeated treatments, now where are you seeing a difference though? Now it's calves that are outdoors, and they say they don't see a difference with jackets. And they didn't see a difference here. Calves outdoors, whether they had jackets or not, they didn't see any differences. Well, that's interesting, right? I mean, because we know, on farms, we know that jackets make a difference, but how, where's science to back that up? And then there's another study, well actually no, it's the same one, in 2004. They were looking at IgGs for calves, that same design, right? Indoor calves or outdoors with or without. And they didn't see any differences in IgG. So now you're starting to think, what the heck, right? I know these jackets work. I see them working on my farm, but where's the science to back it up? So there's another study, 2012, that for the first 4 weeks, so calves during their first 4 weeks of life, they saw a 1.5 pound a day weight gain in calves that had jackets compared to a 1.2 pound per day weight gain in calves that didn't have jackets. Okay, so now you're starting to see, okay, maybe there's some, that weight gain we're talking about, but this was just a preliminary study, and it's really the only one that's out there right now. Okay, and those differences started to disappear after the calves were weaned. Well, that's interesting, but keep in mind, their numbers were pretty low here, right? Not very many calves in this study. And comparatively, we're looking at a beef study. So you put blankets on calves, beef calves, for 118 days, you're looking at a 38-pound difference. So beef calves that had jackets, after that 118 days, they were 30 pounds heavier than the ones that didn't have jackets. Now, because this was a preliminary study, the author did say, this is preliminary, there needs to be more research done. I throw this in there because I want to do some of that research. I think it would be useful to find out what is going on. You put those jackets on, you see the differences on your farms, but how can we measure that?
I'm surprised they can keep the blankets on for that long because ours outgrow them.
Yeah,
they have
do.
to come off when they outgrow them, right?
Right. And so that question of how long do you keep the jackets on? Now, if you keep them on too long and you don't look at them, especially the ones that have the straps, right? So when we went to those 38 farms in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, a lot of them are using jackets, calf jackets, but they were leaving them on and not monitoring if they were fitting right or not. So what happens to those straps on the back of those legs?
They get tight.
They get tight, right? And what do? Eventually they start cutting in. So you start looking around pens and you've got calves that have these gashes on the back of their legs, right? Because those jackets, they were put on and then weren't managed as far as, expanding the straps or anything, and they're just cutting into those legs. So that's something to take into consideration. But ultimately, does anyone notice anything in particular here about this calf? I'm just throwing it out there.
A lot of questions.
Uniquely marked.
Just wanted to throw that out there because it was appropriate. So I'm here today to say I'm new, I'm eager, I'm looking for problems to help fix, and ultimately, I have some business cards I'd like to hand out to anyone that's interested. And we want to Susan and I want to continue putting on programs, to help, what do you need? What are some of those, what do you need from us extension folks as far as education or research or resources, right? So, if you have suggestions now that something's in your head and you say, hey, why doesn't anyone help me with X? Bring it out, say it.
Any studies done for 3 times a day feeding?
For 3 times a day feeding? I think there is some reason.
It'd be kind of like automated calf feeders, I guess.
There are some studies, yeah. So there is some research that came out that, so like automated, just increasing how much milk they get, right? Whether it's over 2 meals or 3 meals, but like an automated calf feeders, there's studies, where they can ramp up to, I don't know, yeah, I usually think of it as liters, but so it's like 10, 12 liters a day. Those calves, compared to 6 liters a day, they're seeing growth like none other. Those calves coming off that feeder at those rates, they're huge.
But automated, 3 times a day feeding, nobody wants to be out there in the.
No.
So can you do 3 times a day in a shorter, say you do. Calves sleep at night anyway, don't they?
Well, yeah, they're resting and they're, yeah. And
so let's say you do a first feeding at 8, noon, and 4.
right, that's doable. The key thing is, one of the things, like yesterday, something we touched on too was, calves having that natural behavior, that urge to want to suck, right? And so allowing enough time for them to fulfill that urge. And if they don't, then they're going to end up on sucking on other things, right? Which is more of an issue in group setting. But I think I know that there's studies with automated feeders feeding, more and number of visits per day that they're allotted and seeing good differences. As far as conventionally, like in Hutches and things like that, I'm not sure about that. It's interesting that you bring it up. Has anyone seen this new robot that's coming out? It's, I think it's in Germany right now. The arm that comes and feeds calves for you. Anyone seen that? It's pretty interesting. So, Forster Technic out of Germany, right? They make a lot of the robotic feeders, the automated feeders and whatnot, and robotic milkers. And well, they now have this arm that if you have a row of Hutches, this robot goes down the row of Hutches and has an arm, and it feeds the calves. Interesting, right? Just throwing it out there. Brand new technology coming out. I don't know where it will work and where it won't, but it's an idea. And maybe that would be an interesting, because if you have a robot that can go out 3 times a day and do that milking for you, right? Yes, sir, you have a question?
Yeah, it's kind of like the robot that we used to have by the farm that we live by. There was a robot that will go down the holes 3 times a day and clean it.
Oh yeah, like a scraper, kind of, in the barn.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, but it was like a robot broom that spins around and goes through, just picks up all the hay and brings it.
So Amber,
Yes.
I'm not a producer, but I'm
Right.
pretend I'm a producer. And
Yeah.
I've just seen a lot of research and literature put up there today, and I'm kind of wondering, like, what am I going to take home with me today?
Right.
What recommendations do you have for me? What can I do today and practically apply on my farm?
Right. So one of the easiest things to do was that nesting score we talked about. That's why everyone hears about it so much, right? Because it's easy. I mean, how easy is it for you to look at a calf and just real quickly, right? You can just like rock right past and say, oh, you know, this looks good. Maybe this one needs a little more bedding. Maybe this one, right? That's easy. That's something you can do today, right? Now, what if, you know, if you're worried about the cold stress, another thing easy to look at too as you're walking through. So you look at the nesting score and you look at, you know, how dry is it? I mean, maybe it's deep, but it's soaked. Is that really going to be a good environment to keep that calf warm? Probably not.